It started with laughter, not ours, theirs. The German tankers, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, believed their Tigers were untouchable. 60 tons of armor, an 88mm main gun that could punch through any Allied vehicle at 1,000 yards, and a reputation carved into the battlefield one village at a time. Wherever a Tiger rolled, American infantry scattered. And when news reached German lines that American soldiers were using shoulder-fired tubes to try and stop them, they howled with laughter. They called it a firecracker, a toy rocket. In the words of one captured panzer officer, it looked like plumbing. We were more worried about birds dropping bombs. But what the enemy didn't see, what they never understood, was that the bazooka wasn't just a weapon. It was a last chance, a Hail Mary, a soldier's desperation wrapped in steel and wire. It was designed not for comfort or convenience or even efficiency. It was made for one thing only: giving a man on foot a shot at something that should have killed him before he got close. And that story starts long before the hedgerows of France. Back in 1942, when American forces landed in North Africa, the M1 Bazooka was introduced to the battlefield for the first time. It was experimental, clunky, and had a short effective range of just over 100 feet. Worse, it jammed in dust and often misfired in rain. Troops using it at Kasserine Pass found themselves firing duds at German Panzer IVs and watching their rockets bounce off like pebbles against a train. General Eisenhower himself ordered a full review of the weapon, and by mid-1943, an improved version, the M1A1, began showing up in field crates across Italy. Lighter, more reliable, more deadly. And yet the mockery never fully faded, because a Tiger still weighed more than 50 bazookas combined, and its frontal armor was thicker than the rocket's penetration capacity. So soldiers adapted. They stopped aiming for the front. They waited for flanking shots, ambush points, close-range strikes where the thinner rear and side armor could be breached. In the hills of Monte Cassino, in the rubble of Anzio, infantry units learned that with courage and a little luck, a bazooka team could stop a steel beast dead in its tracks. But nothing tested them like France. When the Allies stormed Normandy in June of 1944, German armor surged to meet them. Among the Wehrmacht's arsenal were dozens of Tiger I tanks, hulking shadows moving through bocage and farmland like iron ghosts. Roads were too narrow. Air support wasn't always on call. Sometimes it came down to a team of 2 soldiers lying in a ditch, hoping that the next round didn't explode too early or too late. Private First Class James "Mac" McConnell was one of them. A wiry kid from Indiana, never fired a shot in anger until D-Day. But by July, he and his assistant gunner had earned 3 tank silhouettes scratched into the back of their launcher. They didn't brag. There was nothing glamorous about crawling through mud, waiting for a Tiger to roll past, and firing at a vulnerable point with only seconds to react. Mac once said, "It wasn't bravery. It was either shoot or get flattened, and I liked standing." The key was getting close, too close. Most engagements with bazookas happened under 75 feet. That's practically breathing distance for a Tiger crew. But up close, steel had weaknesses: vents, tracks, hatches. With a bit of aim and a lot of guts, a 2.36-inch shaped charge could cook the insides of the biggest tank Germany had. But it wasn't just the rocket that changed. It was the men. By the fall of 1944, bazooka teams had become elite within the infantry. Not in rank, most were privates or corporals, but in reputation. They were the ones who moved ahead during a retreat, the ones who turned corners into kill zones, the ones who stayed when others ran. And the Germans noticed. Reports began to filter through captured documents and radio intercepts, bazooka traps, ambushes from cellar windows, rockets fired from haystacks, sewer drains, even church towers. Tigers started rolling with infantry support just to shield their flanks. Some commanders refused to advance unless the route had been cleared of bazooka positions. Then came the Ardennes. Winter, 1944. Snow buried roads, fog grounded plains, and Hitler launched his last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Tigers, Panthers, and Jagdpanthers surged through Belgium in a lightning strike aimed at splitting Allied forces. Towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith turned into pressure cookers, and once again, the bazooka teams were called upon. In a village just north of Houffalize, a Sherman tank burned quietly in a field. Its crew was gone. The Tiger that killed it was moving toward the church square, methodical and unhurried. Civilians had fled. The air smelled like cordite and pine. In a cellar across the square, 3 Americans waited. Mac McConnell, now a corporal, clutched a frostbitten bazooka in shaking hands. His loader, Private Ruiz, clutched the last 2 rockets they had. The tank was 40 feet away. No backup, no air cover, no time to run. The plan was simple. 1 shot, 1 kill, or none of them would see the sun again. Mac whispered, "Hold steady." Ruiz nodded and handed him the first rocket. They opened the basement window. Snow blew in like ghosts. The Tiger turned toward them, almost as if it sensed. The first rocket hissed out. It hit the Tiger's left tread and exploded in a flash of sparks and smoke. The track buckled. The tank screeched and halted. The turret swung toward them. Second rocket. This one hit just behind the turret ring, the weakest part of a Tiger's armor. There was a flash, then fire, then silence. The Tiger didn't move again. No one laughed this time. When reinforcements arrived hours later, they found 3 exhausted soldiers staring at a smoking metal giant. One officer reportedly said, "You boys just saved a whole damn town." But Mac didn't reply. He was holding Ruiz's helmet, still warm. One of the rounds had punched through a wall during the exchange. It wasn't victory, it was survival. A high cost paid in courage. And in that moment, something changed. Bazooka teams were no longer jokes. They were legends. It didn't take long for the myth of German invincibility to crack. And the cracks always started at the treads. After Houffalize, reports began pouring in from all sectors of the front. Panther crews requesting infantry screens, Tiger commanders refusing to enter tight urban areas without pre-cleared routes. Not because of artillery, not because of tanks, but because of bazookas. The joke weapon, the pipe bomb on a stick, was rewriting battlefield behavior. In one sector outside of Cologne, intelligence officers from the Wehrmacht noted an alarming trend. The Americans weren't backing down. In fact, they were getting closer, bolder. Their infantry seems to have grown teeth, one German memo read. What they didn't realize yet was that it wasn't just courage fueling this new aggression, it was innovation. American infantry had learned the language of steel. Small units began developing techniques in the field, unofficial, unapproved, but devastating. 2-man bazooka cells would bait tanks into kill zones pre-ranged for ambush. Infantry squads carried smoke grenades not just to hide movements, but to confuse German optics, buying precious seconds for a rocket to fly. They timed blasts to distract crews. They fired in pairs, one round to the hull, another to the vision slit. And most importantly, they adapted faster than doctrine allowed. The Germans had built their tanks to crush. The Americans had built their men to outthink. In the battered ruins of Aachen, a city leveled into skeletal walls and twisted wire, a new tactic was born. Called tank sniping, it involved using rooftops as rocket nests. One GI, perched atop a partially collapsed hotel, waited motionless for nearly 6 hours before loosing a shot that killed a Tiger trying to breach a checkpoint. The tank's explosion tore through 3 stories, but the rooftop held, just barely. The gunner climbed down with one less rocket and one more story that would pass into barracks legend. Still, it wasn't always success. Bazooka teams died, often and badly. They were hunted, targeted. German spotters knew the signs: a sudden glint from a window, a puff of smoke from a cellar, a group of 3 soldiers moving faster than they should. Bazooka men were priority targets because they were the only thing on foot that could stop a machine weighing 60 tons. In the Hurtgen forest, they paid a steep price. Snow and mud swallowed sound. Visibility was down to feet. Tigers moved like ghosts among the trees, engines muffled by pine. Entire platoons vanished in the fog, swallowed by steel. Sergeant Amos Delaney, a Louisiana farm boy who had joined the 104th Infantry Division, led one of the last intact Bazooka teams in his company. On December 8th, his unit was pinned by a tiger dug in near a bridge crossing. Artillery couldn't reach it. A Sherman had already tried and failed. Delaney didn't flinch. With 1 round left and 2 men, he crawled 150 yards through frozen mud, past the wreckage of 3 trucks, and into a bomb crater 20 feet from the tank. He waited for the turret to rotate away, then fired. The rocket entered through the engine grill and detonated the ammo rack. The blast flipped the turret like a bottle cap. Delaney lost his hearing for 3 days, but he walked away. When reporters asked him later how it felt to take down a tiger, Delaney just shook his head. It wasn't about feeling. It was about getting my boys across that bridge. And that's what defined the Bazooka teams. They weren't heroes by choice. They were guardians by necessity. They protected choke points. They defended towns. They bought time for medics and escape routes for broken units. Their success rate wasn't measured in kills. It was measured in moments. The moment a tiger missed its shot. The moment a squad escaped down a back alley. The moment a civilian made it out before the next shell landed. Back in Berlin, however, panic was beginning to seep in. The German High Command issued new field memos for panzer operations. Beware of isolated infantry in rubble zones. Do not engage urban targets without infantry support. Expect ambush from rear alleys, sewer grates, and rooftops. Translated: the Americans have learned how to fight us. For the first time since 1941, German armor was reacting instead of dictating. By March 1945, Tigers had stopped being offensive weapons and had become defensive anchors. No longer were they used for spearhead thrusts or dramatic breakouts. Instead, they sat near intersections, guarding supply lines, static, lumbering beasts waiting to be hunted. And hunted they were. The M9 A1 Bazooka, now in wide use, had better sights, stronger penetration, and increased range. New shaped charges burned hotter. New tactics came faster. And perhaps most importantly, belief had shifted. At the beginning of the war, infantry saw tigers as death sentences. By spring, they saw opportunities. This wasn't false bravado. It was battlefield math. Bazooka kills were stacking up, not just in propaganda leaflets, but in official after-action reports. And as confidence grew, so did creativity. In the shattered streets of Nuremberg, a squad from the 69th Infantry used a decoy jeep rigged with smoke to bait a tiger into exposing its side. As the tank lumbered forward to inspect, a 4-man fire team burst from a collapsed bakery and fired 2 bazookas in tandem. Both rockets struck, the crew bailed, the tank burned, and the legend grew. Veteran Tiger Commander Otto Klemperer later wrote in his memoir, Steel in the Shadows, "It was not the American tankers who gave us pause. It was the boys with tubes and nerve. They would hide in places we never expected. They were ghosts with fire." By April 1945, the German army wasn't advancing, it was surviving. The great offensives that once crushed nations had been reduced to tactical retreats and desperate delays. But for those still fighting on the ground, especially on the Western Front, one fear remained constant: the tiger. Yet something had changed, something critical. The fear no longer ran in just one direction. The Tiger I, once the juggernaut of Nazi propaganda, now bore scars from countless close encounters. Bazooka teams had become the stuff of whispered fear in German ranks. Infantrymen, once dismissed as cannon fodder by tank crews, were now threats. In some units, standing orders were given. If infantry is spotted without heavy armor support, assume an ambush. Assume bazookas. That shift, subtle but profound, marked the unraveling of the German armored doctrine. The Tiger had been built for domination: 88mm gun, 4-inch armor plating, a battlefield presence so fearsome it bordered on superstition. But by 1945, superstition was no longer enough. Because now, American GIs were climbing into rubble with tubes slung over their backs, daring the beasts to come closer. In the town of Kassel, this reversal became legend. A Tiger platoon rolled into the outskirts, expecting a resistance-free advance. American armor had pulled back. Artillery was out of position. Only scattered riflemen and medics remained. It should have been a slaughter. It wasn't. 3 GIs, Privates Leon Butera, Raymond Hale, and Jesse Morales, set up on the second floor of a shattered mill. Armed with 2 bazookas and just 6 rounds between them, they waited. When the first Tiger rolled past the courtyard, Hale stood up, steadying the tube on a broken windowsill. Butera spotted for him, calling out distances. Morales watched the flank. The first shot slammed into the Tiger's treads. Not a kill, but a trap. The turret began to rotate. Smoke grenades were thrown. A second rocket hit the rear access plate, sparking an internal fire. The crew bailed. The second Tiger backed off. The third reversed into a debris pile and got stuck. 3 men with 6 rockets had halted an entire Tiger platoon. Their action wasn't just tactical brilliance. It was psychological war. When those stories reached other units, morale surged. Not from glory, but from possibility. Because what the GIs on the ground were learning, and what German commanders feared, was that the Tiger was vulnerable. Not easy, not guaranteed, but vulnerable. And that was enough. Enough to give men the courage to crawl another foot. Enough to make them stand their ground in ruined cities. Enough to make a bazooka more than a weapon. It was a declaration. We're not running anymore. Inside German briefings, the data told a darker story. Reports from field commanders noted increased tank losses in close-quarters engagements, not to artillery, not to air power, but to infantry. Tank-on-tank battles had become rare. This was a different war now, a street war, a rubble war, a war of windows and shadows and alleyways. In Stuttgart, a Tiger was taken out by a 19-year-old corporal from Cleveland who had lost both squad mates an hour earlier. He waited behind a burnt-out ambulance for 4 hours, not because he was told to, but because he believed he could. When asked later what made him stay, he said, "Someone had to." That quote circulated through field reports, letters, and eventually command posts. It wasn't bluster, it was grit. The kind of grit that Tiger Steel couldn't repel. Back in the States, newsreels began to shift. No longer were the headlines focused solely on generals and massive maneuvers. Now they showed stills of GIs crouched in rubble, bazooka over shoulder, enemy tank burning behind them. "David versus Goliath," one headline read. But it wasn't myth anymore. It was fact. The American infantryman had redefined what was possible in modern warfare. He didn't need to match the Tiger's weight. He didn't need to match its firepower. He only needed to believe the Tiger could be killed and get close enough to prove it. Of course, not every encounter was a victory. The losses were brutal. For every Tiger destroyed, 3, sometimes 4 teams were wiped out. But they kept coming, not from orders, but from defiance, from memory, from friends lost, and from the quiet knowledge that someone had to. In Munich, on May 1st, 1945, the war was all but over. One final skirmish flared on the edge of the city, a last-ditch German defensive maneuver to hold key crossroads for civilian evacuation. A single Tiger was placed in front of a bridge over the Isar River. It would be the last operational Tiger tank encountered by American forces in the European theater. And it would be destroyed by a 21-year-old sergeant named Carl Foster. Foster had watched 2 of his men get cut down trying to flank the tank. He'd been hit with shrapnel the day before and was fighting on adrenaline and fury. Crawling through sewer runoffs, he emerged behind the tank under cover of darkness. He had 1 round, no backup, no way out. He fired and hit the fuel cap. The tank didn't explode, not right away. Instead, it began to burn, thick smoke pouring out, panic on the comms, crew bailing in confusion. A second rocket, fired minutes later by another team that had heard the chaos, finished the job. The last Tiger fell not to a tank, not to a bomb, but to 2 exhausted, wounded men with no options left. It was the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written in grit, smoke, and blood. When the war ended, Bazooka teams weren't paraded. They didn't make the covers of magazines. They were shadows in the margins, names on casualty reports and citations buried in archives. But for the men who saw them in action, for the tankers they saved, for the medics they covered, for the towns they protected, they were more than names. They were guardians. The Tiger was built to make men run, but in the end, it was the Tiger that turned away. Because sometimes the strongest armor isn't steel, it's belief, it's resolve. It's the idea that a man with a tube and a plan can stop a machine that cost millions. The Germans had mocked the bazooka until it became the last thing their tank crews saw. When the guns fell silent in 1945, much of the world exhaled. Parades erupted, flags flew, medals were pinned, tank crews rolled home to accolades, fighter pilots returned as legends, generals were immortalized in books. But the men who carried the war on their shoulders, literally, returned quietly. No fanfare for the bazooka teams, no ticker tape for the men who crawled under barbed wire, clutched tubes that glowed red hot, and stared down barrels of 88mm cannons from stone's throw range. Yet what they left behind was seismic, because modern warfare had changed, and it wasn't the Tiger tank that changed it. It was the man who killed the Tiger. In the after-action reports compiled by Allied Command, something became clear. Infantry-based anti-tank warfare had transformed from last resort into battlefield doctrine. The bazooka wasn't a one-off miracle. It was a statement of flexibility, of adaptability, of desperation turned into advantage. Pentagon analysts took note. West Point cadets were taught scenarios based on bazooka ambushes from cities like Aachen, Metz, and Bastogne. What worked wasn't just the firepower. It was the courage to use it up close, under fire, while everything screamed to run the other direction. In those classrooms, black and white footage rolled. A GI with a bazooka slung over his shoulder, smoke trailing from a tank behind him. The narration flatly stated, "Anti-armor capability now exists in the hands of the infantry." Battlefield decentralization is no longer a vulnerability, it's a strength. In other words, give one soldier the right weapon and the battlefield tilts. Across the ocean, in Soviet command briefings, the Americans' success with portable anti-tank weapons didn't go unnoticed either. They'd seen what bazooka squads could do to German armor, and they responded with their own answer, the RPG. The rocket-propelled grenade was born not out of engineering inspiration, but as a direct reaction to what one U.S. sergeant did behind a bakery in Metz with a bazooka and 1 round left. The legacy was clear. Tanks would never again own the battlefield alone. No matter how thick the armor, there would always be someone in the shadows with fire in their hands and the will to use it. But even as doctrine evolved, the men who pioneered it were fading from memory. The bazooka teams didn't return home as heroes in most places. Some were absorbed back into infantry battalions. Others discharged, scattered across the country with Purple Hearts in drawers and stories their neighbors couldn't imagine. There was no film made for Jesse Morales, no parade for Carl Foster, no monuments listing the names of the tank killers who fought without armor, without turrets, without a way to retreat. Yet their fellow soldiers remembered. Years later, in a reunion of the 30th Infantry Division, a tanker named Bill Harris was asked what saved his crew in the Ardennes. He didn't hesitate. Some kid with a bazooka and nerves of steel. I never even caught his name. But I remember the sound when he fired, and the silence when that panther stopped moving. In the years that followed, war returned, not to Europe but to Korea, then Vietnam, and beyond. And in every conflict, young soldiers slung a new version of the bazooka across their backs. It was lighter, faster, deadlier. But it carried more than explosives. It carried memory. In Seoul, a Marine knelt behind sandbags, his law rocket aimed down a street flooded with T-34s. He wasn't thinking about patents or battlefield evolution. He was thinking about whether he'd make it home. He was thinking about that one shot, just like they did in Italy, in France, in the rubble of Berlin. In museums today, the bazooka often sits behind glass, inert, quiet, cold. But behind that silence is a roar. Because the bazooka was never about the tube. It was about the man willing to hold it, to aim it, to use it when every instinct told him to run. Modern soldiers train with far more advanced systems. Javelins, AT-4s, drone-guided munitions. But the DNA is the same. The bazooka teams of World War II were the proof of concept, that infantry didn't have to be outgunned, only underestimated. And in World War II, the Germans underestimated them. They laughed at the idea that a soldier with a shoulder-fired tube could stop a tiger, until it exploded. Back in Kassel, where 3 American GIs once halted a platoon of tigers with just 6 rounds, there's now a quiet memorial. It doesn't list their names, just a small plaque on the wall of a rebuilt schoolhouse. It reads, "This ground witnessed courage that steel could not stop, in memory of those who carried fire and never stepped back." It doesn't mention the bazooka. It doesn't need to, because the legacy wasn't the weapon. It was the will. Before the explosion, before the cheers, before the stunned tank crew climbed out of their smoldering steel coffin, there was a heartbeat, a pause, a prayer maybe. That's the truth they don't tell you in war films. Firing a bazooka wasn't cinematic. It was claustrophobic. You carried 13 pounds of shoulder-fired defiance. You had maybe 1 or 2 rockets. No backup. No turret to swivel. No armor to shield you. You had seconds to make a decision, and if you missed, you died. That was the weight carried by men like Corporal Alan Meeks. In the Ardennes, he hid behind a snowbank, frostbitten, shaking, a bazooka clutched in numb fingers. A German panzer rolled into view, idling as infantry dismounted behind it. Meeks had 1 rocket. He didn't breathe. He just stood, aimed, and fired. Direct hit. The explosion flipped the turret like a bottle cap. One of the infantrymen burst into flames. The rest scattered. The snow turned black, and Meeks collapsed into it, not from wounds, but from everything he'd held in. The Army called it courage. Meeks called it survival. That's what separates the legends from the reality. Bazooka teams didn't charge into battle with bravado. They crept, crawled, waited, sweated, prayed. Their kills weren't trophies, they were reactions, because when a tank turned toward you, everything else disappeared. There was no strategy, no politics, no flag, just fire and steel. Some froze, others fired. And even those who succeeded often paid a price no medal could cover. In post-war studies on combat stress, an alarming trend emerged. Anti-tank weapon operators had some of the highest reported rates of battlefield trauma. The proximity to death, the pressure of precision, the knowledge that every shot counted, and missing meant watching friends die. It all added up. Veterans like Joe Lansing, who knocked out 2 Panthers in Italy, later confessed that every time he saw a garbage truck back home, the shape reminded him of a tank. Lansing couldn't sit with his back to doors. He couldn't hear diesel engines without flinching. He never watched war movies. When asked in a documentary about his greatest achievement, he just said, "I came home." This wasn't weakness. It was the unseen scar of being the last line of defense, of hearing a commander's voice in your radio say, "Tank incoming," "Bazooka team move up," and knowing you were the only thing between 60 tons of German steel and the men behind you. That kind of weight breaks something, or it forges something stronger than armor. At Fort Benning, years later, a new training course was introduced for light anti-tank tactics. Recruits were shown grainy footage from Normandy, Sicily, the Ardennes. "Watch this frame," the instructor would say. A lone soldier darting from rubble, kneeling, firing. A German tank lurching, then stopping. See what he did? He didn't flinch. That was the lesson. But what the footage didn't show was what happened 5 seconds after. The soldier vomiting from adrenaline, his buddy checking if he was hit. The silence that followed because they knew, just barely, they were still alive. There's a story passed down through the 2nd Armored Division, never written, always told, about a private named Henry Dawson in Cologne. Dawson wasn't supposed to be in the line that day. His squad had taken heavy casualties the day before. They were resting, rearming. But when the call came that a tiger had broken through the alley behind the cathedral, Dawson grabbed a bazooka and sprinted, alone. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't calculate odds. He ducked behind a church pillar, took aim, and fired just as the tiger began to rotate its turret. The round struck under the track. A perfect hit. The tank buckled, smoke erupted, and Dawson disappeared in the blast. His body was found a day later, burned, half buried under rubble, still clutching the empty launcher. His actions saved 43 men. No one had time to say thank you. But they remembered. What's remarkable about stories like Dawson's is not their rarity. It's how common they were. Time and again, in cities across Europe, it was the man with the bazooka who changed the tide. Not always with finesse. Sometimes it was luck, sometimes desperation, but more often it was something else. A kind of resolve, an understanding that no one else was going to stop the tank, and so they would, no matter what it cost. Today, battlefield analysts talk about force multipliers, weapons or tactics that amplify the effectiveness of small units. Bazooka teams were the original force multipliers. 2 soldiers, one aiming, one loading, could halt an armored advance, could change a command decision, could tip an entire engagement. And they did. But they didn't come home to teach at West Point. Many went back to small towns, to farms, to factories. Their stories faded, their roles reduced to footnotes in unit citations. Yet in every war since, the doctrine carries their fingerprints. The idea that one man with the right weapon and the right willpower can reshape the battlefield, that's theirs. They proved it in forests, in ruins, in 6-minute standoffs that rewrote the fate of entire companies. By the time the last Tiger tank had been towed off a French field, Scorched and unrecognizable, the American Bazooka men were already being redeployed to new fronts. There was no ceremony, no spotlight, no brass bands, just a crumpled launcher on their shoulder, a spent rocket tube tossed aside, and the echo of a tank still burning in the distance. But make no mistake, those men had changed the war, not with air power, not with overwhelming force, but with nerve, with a two-man team, a shoulder-fired tube, and the will to crawl closer when everyone else fell back. The Germans had laughed at the bazooka at first, called it crude, a toy, a coward's weapon. They stopped laughing once Tigers started exploding. They mocked the weapon until it became legend. They mocked the men until they couldn't anymore. What those men carried into battle wasn't just a shaped charge. It was a promise that the tide could be turned by courage alone. And for a few brutal, blistering, unforgettable moments across Europe, it was. That's the part the textbooks sometimes miss, because the legacy of the Bazooka team isn't just military, it's human. It's what happens when two soldiers step into the path of giants and say, "We'll take the shot," because someone has to. At Fort Irwin today, modern soldiers train with javelins and anti-tank guided missiles, sleek, advanced, laser-guided. But instructors still teach the basics: movement, positioning, timing. And then they tell the stories about the guy in Italy who hit a panther from the second floor of a barn, then jumped out the window when it exploded below. About the frozen foxhole in the Ardennes, where two kids from Oklahoma stopped a German armored column cold. About the alley in Cologne, where a single blast from a PFC's bazooka turned a Tiger into scrap metal and changed the fight for an entire battalion. These aren't just war stories. They're doctrine, they're memory, they're reminders. Every military has its giants, its Pattons, its Eisenhowers, its Bradleys. But the war was won, battle by men whose names never made it past the company roster, whose stories were folded into after-action reports and forgotten by morning. But those men, the bazooka teams, they carried the war on their shoulders, literally. And their impact? It went far beyond the blast radius. Because when a general saw what two grunts could do with one rocket, strategy changed. Tactics shifted. Infantry squads were reorganized. Armor-heavy assaults were reevaluated. The very psychology of warfare shifted. No tank could roll confidently through a village again without checking every window, every ditch, every cellar. Because the bazooka man might be waiting. And beyond the battlefield, there's the lesson for all of us. Sometimes, it's not the biggest gun that matters. Sometimes it's not even the best plan. Sometimes it's just the two people who say, "We'll go." The loader and the shooter, the spotter and the runner. The guy with the shaking hands who still squeezes the trigger. That's courage. Not absence of fear, but action in spite of it. The Tiger tank may have been an engineering marvel, but in war, numbers don't always tell the full story. Germany built 1,347 Tigers. America fielded 49,234 Shermans. But the real wild card was the team in the rubble with a bazooka. They weren't supposed to win, but often they did. Today, few original M1 bazookas survive outside museums. Most are rusted relics, hanging behind glass, their power forgotten by all but a few old men who remember what it felt like to fire one. The kick, the hiss of the rocket, the silence before impact, and then thunder, and maybe, if they were lucky, survival. You won't find the names of most bazooka men etched into monuments, but you'll find their ghosts in the doctrine of every military that came after. You'll find their courage in the eyes of modern infantry, in the fire drills of tank hunters, in the mottos of small units around the world. Close with, destroy, move. You'll find it in every underdog who knows they're outgunned and steps up anyway. You'll find it in every soldier who shoulders a weapon heavier than their own fear. In the end, they mocked the Bazooka teams, until they couldn't anymore, until a Tiger exploded in an alley it was never supposed to lose, until the war shifted because someone with no tank, no armor, and no backup dared to fire first. And that's why their story matters. Because sometimes the biggest explosions come from the smallest chances. Because sometimes one rocket, one moment can change everything. So here's to the Bazooka teams. They didn't just carry firepower. They carried the weight of every man behind them, and they never let it drop.